expertise in different areas. Very briefly, my name is Jason Leaf, and I work part-time for the National Immigration Forum as a Bibles, Badges, and Business Mobilizer. We're doing this in partnership with the Mormon Women for Ethical Government. Rachel Albertson is the one helping us do the Zoom and do everything behind the scenes, and Miranda Cutler is here as well, and she will be leading the conversation in the second panel. So the first panel is framing the issue, what is the Afghan Adjustment Act and why is it needed? And I just want to very briefly introduce our panelists. So we have Danilo Zak, who is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for the National Immigration Forum. Laura Dietz, who is the co-founder and director of strategic partnerships for the task Force Nix, a women-led nonprofit dedicated to the relocation and resettlement of at-risk Afghan activists and allies. Linda Greising, how do I say your name? Is it Greising or what? How do you say that your name?
Greising, yeah.
Yeah, all right, good. Linda Greising is staff attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights, which provides pro bono representation and advocacy for non-citizens in Minnesota and the Dakotas. Susanna Cunningham is the advocacy manager at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service and a leader in the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition. And Chris Purdy is a veteran and director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach at Human Rights First. And we may be joined in a little bit by Crystal Bayat, who's an Afghan social activist and human rights advocate, known for her protests against the Taliban takeover, and she is the founder of the Crystal Bayat Foundation. So to get started, Chris, let's start with you. And if you could speak a little bit to the context of what it is that we're talking about. What happened last August, and how has it impacted the Afghan people?
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone for putting on for being here, and for Mormon Women for Ethical Government for putting on this great event. So myself and Susanna and a lot of other people on both these panels have been working on this issue for a long time. About a year ago, when the Biden administration, over a year ago now, when the Biden administration announced their intent to withdraw, many of us got together and started thinking about, we see this huge tsunami that's coming. The Taliban were taking over provincial capitals. They were cutting off access into Kabul. Slowly but surely, they were gaining ground. And we could see that there were a significant number of people who were going to be left behind to be murdered by the Taliban. And so we started thinking about what other precedents have we had in U.S. history where we can look to provide some sort of pathway to get these people out of the country. So we came up with this idea in April of last year of evacuating about 20,000 Afghans and their families. At that time, we were considering primarily the special immigrant visa holders, these folks who served alongside American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan and are eligible for a special pathway into the United States. We tried to get the administration to evacuate these people preemptively in April and May and June of last year, bring them to Guam, process them in Guam, and then from Guam, they would be distributed out to the United States, very similar to what actually ended up happening. We were unsuccessful in getting the administration to do it at that level. We were successful to a limited extent when the administration announced Operation Allies of Refuge at the end of July of last year, which essentially put the infrastructure in place for an evacuation. We did not realize that August 14th was going to be a cataclysmic event in the Afghan history and a very pivotal moment in the United States history as well. But Operation Allies Refuge was there in place to allow for the evacuation of 80,000 or so Afghans from Kabul airport. And that was about a 2-week operation. It was traumatic for a lot of people. Many of us had sleepless nights trying to get people on flights. I myself was able to assist, some really brave folks get through the wire, as it was called, into the airport, onto flights, and onto further travel. So from that, moment on, we now have this huge population of people here in the United States and in third countries around the world that we need to do something about. We made a promise to these people. We made a promise to the country of Afghanistan And we need to honor that.
Well, thanks for that context. And I'm going to go to Danilo now. And Danilo, can you unpack for us, given the context of the withdrawal and the many Afghan people who are now here in the United States, what is the Afghan Adjustment Act? Maybe give a little bit of the history of how adjustment acts have been used in the past, and then maybe also speak to what is the status of the legislation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. And thanks everyone for having this event. I think it's really important to share as much information about this as possible, and also to generate support for this act, which would be critically important for those Afghans who have been evacuated and made it to the US. And certainly, we can talk more about, and those who will follow me will talk more about why this is so necessary, but more broadly, just what an Adjustment Act is. The reality is, because of these people didn't come under a formal refugee program or formal refugee process, they're not here with permanent status. So they came under parole, which we'll talk more about, but they don't have the same access to, permanent stability in the US and a path to citizenship that a refugee might have, or even an SIV, which Chris just discussed, might have, at least immediately. And for that reason, they need this additional piece of legislation passed by Congress to provide access to that permanent status, or access to adjust to that permanent status. That's why it's called an Adjustment Act. And this is not unusual at all. Parole has been used repeatedly and to great effect to facilitate emergency evacuations of allies and others at risk in the past, following several withdrawals of US troops from war-torn regions, after the Vietnam War in 1975, in 1996, after the first Iraq War. It was used, parole is used for Cubans fleeing the Fidel Castro regime. It's always been used because it's an emergency protocol. It moves quickly, it's flexible. That said, it doesn't provide formal refugee status, and it doesn't provide a path to permanence. And so what's also typically done in the past is the passage of an Adjustment Act by Congress, which allows these people who have typically been vetted, processed, they're connected to US efforts overseas, they've made it to the US, but they're not here under permanent status. So they need this Adjustment Act. And again, this has happened after Cubans fled the Fidel Castro regime. There was an Adjustment Act for Cubans. There was an Adjustment Act after America's withdrawal from Vietnam. And following military actions in Iraq, there was an Adjustment Act. This is a really typical standard thing that Congress really needs to do, is just this second piece, right? We've evacuated folks. We know members of Congress were really active, and many of them cared deeply during the evacuation about getting folks out. But now they're here in the US without a path to permanent status, without access to that stability that many of them really need. And of course, there's no option to return them to Afghanistan. There's no safety. There's no safe home there. So that's why the Adjustment Acts typically get used. And we've also heard, from members on both sides of the aisle that they want to get something done in this issue. There is real energy to address this issue. We've heard from veterans groups, as we're going to talk about, from faith leaders all across the country. People who have welcomed Afghans into their communities are eager to get something done for this population and pass an Adjustment Act. But a bill has not yet been introduced in Congress. I think Susanna can talk a little bit more about some of the attempts that have been made and where we are right now. But I think it's a moment where we need to really pressure the administration and pressure Congress to get something done, because it's something that we've done in the past, and we're kind of at this 50% of fulfilling our promises here, where there's some people left in Afghanistan that we need to get out, and also we need to follow through with those who have been resettled here and give them a path to permanent status.
Thank you for that description. Susanna, if you could speak to a couple of different things. So there's some lingo that I think for those of us who are in this work, we get used to, like, SIV, asylum, parole, and so on. So could you define some of those terms so that other people might be able to better understand it? And then speak to the status of evacuees right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm the right person to answer this question, but because I have often said acronyms are my kryptonite. So yeah, we get really used to throwing around these terms because of the frequency we use, for the frequency with which we use them. So the first is special immigrant visa, SIV. It's the term given to interpreters who served along military service members at post 9/11. So we have interpreters that were in Iraq, and we have interpreters in Afghanistan. And in 2009, a congressman named Earl Blumenauer from Oregon passed a bill that would create the SIV program, basically, in essence, saying for those who helped keep many service members and, to be frank, diplomats alive during the U.S. mission in Afghanistan, in this case, that there be a pathway for them to seek safety in the U.S. if they are persecuted as a result of their alliance and partnership with U.S. military service members. And we've done that. We did that in Iraq, and we've done that in Afghanistan. And all across the nation, there are military service members, including on this call, who served with someone who, in many cases, kept them alive or had an explicit moment where they kept them alive and saved them. And we also have explicit moments as part of these cases where they've been persecuted. The New York Times did a heartbreaking but fantastic piece, I think a month and a half ago, a docuseries on the continued persecution of interpreters that were left behind in Afghanistan. So there's a special immigrant visas. There's a term called humanitarian parolee, as Danilo pointed out. This term, which actually, tens of thousands of people have received, in part because its ability to be an agile tool to get people to safety. And as Danilo pointed out, with these individuals, they come and they're able to come through in an expedient way, which I think is what we all wanted as we saw the Afghan government fall and the Taliban shockingly sweep the country. From legislators in the Senate and the House to people who, served in Afghanistan among our 20-year engagement in the country, to people who also served in the diplomatic corps or as journalists or women's rights advocates under USAID programs, et cetera. Watching all of that crumble so quickly, what we prayed for with our hands and our feet and sleepless nights was that people would get out. And they did through an expedient program like humanitarian parole, as they have, as Danilo pointed out, after the fall of Saigon. But they are left in a status that I often do this little hand gesture that if this is the SIV program, the Special Immigrant Visa Program, as Representative Earl Blumenauer created, or the refugee program as US Congress created, this is humanitarian parole in terms of protections. These two programs, SIV and the refugee program, provide a pathway to lawful permanent residence. They will be able to apply for a green card and ultimately apply for citizenship as conferred through those programs. That's what Congress built. And only by the nature of needing to get people out do they not have that protection. And after each other US military war evacuation in modern history, Congress has seen, I will correct this. I will stand up because we did this to get people out quickly, but they are our allies and we will assure them lasting protection. That is only in this circumstance that there is this historic collapse in legislative leadership to do right by our allies. And allies can mean people who stood up and said, I believe what the US says when they say that I can have a right to speak and education and to drive and to work, even though I am a woman. And I will do all of that. And I will do that. And I believe, because I believe in this project, or I believe in the idea of a democratic Afghanistan. And all the people who stood up to do that, those being our allies, because that ultimately was the mission. The mission was to try to give a sort of a hope for a democratic future for Afghanistan. So I think to a lot of people, and Chris can speak to some of this, it's somewhat shocking that the collapse of legislative leadership to give lasting protection for these folks follows the US's longest war. So,
yeah, and this might be a question that each of you could speak to, and we can come back, Danilo, to you a little bit later. But why, briefly, why the collapse? I mean, why do you think in the past, when these acts have been passed, it seems to have been done in a bipartisan way? Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it seems like it was bipartisan. I know in Iowa, where I live, in the 70s and 80s, Robert Ray, a Republican governor, opened up the state to Southeast Asians. What's going on right now that is causing this legislation that maybe most people would say seems common sense to not get done?
Yeah, I'll just do this and then I'll pass it over to Danilo. I think the first part is we do have Republican and Democratic sponsors for this bill in both chambers. There is support. What there seems to have been is a politicization of every corner, every crevice of immigration that blinds legislators to the bipartisan support that there exists for this issue. I mean, everyone on this panel will be able to speak to how that shows up in their communities. For us, for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, we're a faith-based organization who's been around for 80 years. We saw 100,000 volunteers sign up to welcome Afghans. We've never had a tenth of that after a crisis. And it's all over the country. And we do have Republican sponsors and people willing to support, but there are these the way that Congress works, there are these really powerful committees. And there has been such a politicization of the committees that these need to move through. And I'll just name call, frankly, Senator Chuck Grassley, who serves as a ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, has been unmoved by veterans' pleas across the aisle to pass this act. And I'll just say the last thing before passing to Danilo, who maybe give some context, but say that the American Legion, Student Veterans for America, Veterans for American Ideals, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the list goes on of veteran groups who have asked for Senator Grassley and other leaders on the judiciary to pass this bill. And they have not yet been able to persuade the senator in their opposition, in his opposition to an Afghan Adjustment Act. And I know that Bloomberg and Washington Post and a number of different editorial boards have come out somewhat shocked and aghast that this hasn't happened yet. But as I promised, I'll hand that over to Danilo because I think he can give some context.
Yeah, briefly, Danilo, if you could speak to that a little bit too.
Sure. I'll just say, from the forum does a lot of work trying to build bipartisan compromise, and we've seen that in this issue. This better than I do, Jason, that how many different groups from around the country, including many groups who are firmly on the center right, are very supportive of this effort. There is real bipartisan support here. The reality is with Congress today is you can always bet on them not to get something done. And there needs to be constant urgency, constant, calling your representatives and telling them that this is an urgent issue. And I think one of the problems, and this might tee up the next part of this conversation, is that there's some misunderstanding from some representatives about how urgent this is. Some people think that there are other pathways potentially people can go down. They don't realize how important this is. And so that's part of the problem. But more broadly is, again, you can always trust Congress not to get something done. And so it's all about continuing to sort of put pressure on them and holding them accountable, because that's what advocacy is all about.
Well, and that does tee us up for the next question, and I'll go to Lindsay with this question. Why not these existing pathways? I know some of the conversations that I've had with senators' offices who are on the judiciary, Senator Sass, for example, his office, that's the question that keeps coming up is why do we need this special adjustment, and why not these other pathways?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And I'll echo everybody's thoughts in thanking everybody who put together this panel and those of you who are taking the time to join. It's really important. I work in this every day, as do all of us on the call, and it's always a boon that other people are interested and that we have other folks kind of navigating the process with us. So I just want to kind of piggyback on what Danilo and Susanna talked about, which is the need for permanence for folks who are in the United States and were evacuated. So, we want people we've brought people here in a promise of fulfilling our promise to our allies. And we want them to have a sense of permanence in the United States, because we know from history that if people aren't given that sense of permanence, then they don't commit to our communities, and that increases crime, and it also fails to fulfill our promise to folks that we made this huge commitment to, and that frankly made a huge commitment to us. I've worked in immigration for a number of years and have seen kind of how that impacts people who don't have a path to permanence. In Minnesota, we have one of the largest Somali populations outside of Somalia. They were never given a path to permanence. And so we had many Somalis who were here for 20 years and then kind of in this limbo, felt like they either couldn't commit to their communities or did commit. And then with a change in administration, right, then we saw a number of them face deportation. I had several clients who had families here, had businesses here, and then were deported back to Somalia after 30 years in the United States. And so we don't want that to happen to our communities that we've brought here and made a commitment to. We want them to be able to stay. I just recently talked to one of our clients who said he's advocating for his fellow Afghans in Minnesota to buy cars because you need them to get around, and people aren't wanting to buy cars because they're like, well, what am I going to do after 2 years when my parole expires? I don't have a path to stay here. So why would I invest in a car? So you extrapolate that out, and that's the reason it's so important, is we want people to be able to stay. We also want people to be able to petition for family members to come and join them. Think about all of the images we saw of people who were separated from families just in the rush to get out of Afghanistan. Parole and temporary protected status, TPS, which also is a path, do not offer an ability to petition for family members to come join you. So that keeps people separated from families or forces them potentially to make the really scary decision to have to go back to be with family members. It also doesn't allow people to travel. So, without a green card or the ability to get a refugee travel document, for example, people are stuck in the United States. And that impacts businesses. I've had many clients who are incredible researchers or, great, have so many contributions to make and are really, really talented, but they're in the United States without an ability to leave the United States. So when their employer asks them to go to a conference in Europe, for example, they can't, because if they leave, they will lose their ability to come back to safety. So it's not just this need to, keep people here and fulfill our promise. It's all of these kind of multiplier effects. So within our immigration system, we have a very limited pathway for people to remain in the US. We also have a number of very significant bars that are pretty easy to trigger for people to not be able to stay here. So even if, for example, you have a family member in the United States who could file a petition for you to be able to stay, if you have minor criminal issues or a immigration violation in the past, those can trigger bars that don't allow you to get status, even if you would otherwise qualify. So within kind of our limited structure, asylum is what often comes up as an option for folks who have been evacuated, and why are we not having people apply for that? So it's incredibly resource intensive to apply for asylum. It's also incredibly traumatizing for the asylee, and it's really nuanced. So we have a ton of pro bono attorneys who support our work helping people apply for asylum in our immigration system. These are all people who have law degrees, speak English as their first language, or at least well enough that they graduated from an American law school, and practice some sort of law in their daily life. And every single pro bono that I've worked with has expressed incredible shock at how complex an asylum case is. So if you think about someone who maybe doesn't speak English as their first language or doesn't speak English at all, has no legal education or not a legal education in the United States, it's impossible to expect them to navigate our asylum system without an attorney. But there's just not enough pro bono support to help everyone that is here. Our organization serves people in Minnesota and the Dakotas. We have an incredible pool of pro bono attorneys, like Susanna said. The outpouring of interest in doing something after the evacuation has been incredibly inspiring, but it's still not enough to meet the need. And it also is going to require a lot of time to train people to be able to navigate this very, very complex immigration system.
And go ahead.
Yeah. So that means that maybe people are going to have to hire private immigration lawyers, and that's incredibly expensive. And I know Susanna has mentioned to me, how many veterans have talked about pulling money out of their own pockets to help their counterparts and pay for these immigration fees. I know, having worked in private practice in immigration, it can be $6,000 to $10,000 for somebody to take on an asylum case for people. And so that's just not realistic, and it's just not necessary. It's also incredibly traumatizing for people. So these are all people who have experienced really traumatic things in their life and are probably continuing to experience them because they're hearing reports from family members about what's going on in Afghanistan. An asylum interview is a 2 to 5 hour, I've heard reports that some Afghan interviews are taking 2 days, having people come back to talk about what happened to them, of a person having to tell incredibly personal details about the worst things that have happened to them in their life. It is a individualized determination where every asylum case is determined based on the persecution that individual person feels that they would suffer. Opposite, an Adjustment Act would allow just people who fit specific categories. So an Afghan national who's been in the United States since August, for example, who's not otherwise barred from entry and maybe was paroled in. That's kind of how the other Adjustment Acts that Daniela mentioned. Those would allow people to simply submit an application with evidence that they meet those standards, and then an officer would be able to adjudicate that case. They would probably have an interview where they would go through some of those bars that keep us safe and uphold our national security as well as vetting, but it doesn't require the person to relive these incredibly traumatizing events. And so it's really important to think about that as well. There's also a number of bars to asylum that are really concerning, that might make it impossible for folks from Afghanistan to get asylum, even if they decide to pay the money or find a pro bono attorney and navigate the system. A big one is that people have to apply within 1 year of entry to the United States. There's a small exception to that if people are in a status already, but I know lots of folks that we're talking to are really just, that's on their mind every day. Like, when do I need to apply for asylum so that I don't miss the opportunity to do that? And so that's the urgency that Daniela is talking about. We need to pass an Adjustment Act so that people don't constantly have fear that they're missing out on their opportunity to apply for adjustment or for status, and also so that we can get the ball rolling so that people can apply for family members to come and join them, because that's one of the biggest concerns we hear as well from people. And I will also just say, sorry, this is very long, but this is a good example of how complex our immigration system is. I will also just say that the asylum system is very resource intensive. So I mentioned that you have to have this individualized determination with an asylum officer interviewing you, reviewing your case. That requires, there's only the asylum office within U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service has specialized asylum officers who have to be hired and trained and paid. And so that's a very narrow amount of people who can take take on these cases. And even if USCIS started a hiring spree to ramp up and be able to adjudicate asylum cases for Afghans, it would take us some time. And it's, again, just not necessary, because we could do this alternative path where we know that every person who meets these specific criteria just needs to submit their application and go through a smaller, less intensive interview that can be done by a USCIS officer that's trained, but not through this specific, very, very higher standards of trauma-informed interviewing, et cetera, that the asylum office looks at. So to give some context, the asylum system is incredibly overwhelmed. For our cases, it's taking at least 3 years for someone to get an asylum interview after submitting their case. And while Congress did pass expedited processing for Afghan asylum cases, we already have timelines in our immigration laws for asylum cases that are never met. So I mentioned that it's taking 3 years for my clients to get an asylum interview. The immigration laws say that an asylum case needs to be adjudicated within 180 days. So we aren't great at meeting these deadlines, even if they're in our laws. So not a lot of hope that people with claims from Afghanistan will be able to get their cases expeditiously processed. And if someone's denied because they're, for whatever reason, the asylum officer isn't able to positively adjudicate their case, they're then referred to immigration court. And there's currently a backlog in immigration court of 1.5 million cases. I have clients who are, not scheduled for a hearing in front of an immigration judge for 5 years. So we're really asking people who have believed in our mission to put their life on hold for at least 3 to 5 years, because we can't just pass a simple adjustment act that's also beneficial to us, because we don't have to expend incredible government resources.
Well, that's very helpful. And there's one issue that I'm going to bring up, but then I'm going to turn to Miriam and we can come back to it. But one of the things that I've heard, and I'm sure that you've heard as well in talking with offices, is the vetting issue. It seems to be the go-to, like, well, what about proper vetting? And so, Laura, especially, I'm going to come to you after Miriam, if that's something that you could even speak to and think about vetting, and we can have others kind of speak into that as well, is how do you respond to that? But I want to turn to Miriam, and thank you for being here, first of all. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And one of the things that we would love to hear from you on this panel is some context of what happened in Afghanistan in August, and kind of giving that context from your own experience about why something like this Afghan Adjustment Act is necessary. But if you could introduce yourself and maybe tell a little bit of your own experience and story.
First and foremost, thank you for having me part of this panel. My name is Miriam Salomon Khail, and I'm a member of parliament, and I represent the Kuchis, or the nomads of Afghanistan, which reside in 34 provinces. I was also the deputy speaker for the Defense Commission, and I was the deputy speaker for the Refugees, Martyrs, Disabled Commission, a Kuchi commission as well. I've taught in over 8 provinces about safety, awareness, security, psychological awareness to women throughout Afghanistan, and now I'm a member of parliament in exile. On August 15th, on August, actually, for me, my escape started 3 days before. 3 days before, our intelligence office, our intelligence ministry called me and told me that within 72 hours, if I don't leave the country, I'll go missing. A friend of mine in the United States was the one who bought me my ticket to leave to India. And I didn't want to leave. And I was in denial. And I think most Afghans in Afghanistan were in denial. We thought the United States was going to stand with us for the long run. We didn't believe that after 20 years, over 20 years of standing with us, bringing democracy, bringing in education, women's rights. We passed a law about the EVA law, which was violence against women. We passed the Child Protection Act, which was basically laying the foundation down to stop child marriages. We had safe houses for women who were abused. We couldn't believe that whatever excuse was made, let's say there were many corrupt people in Afghanistan. First and foremost, show me what country doesn't have any corruption. Second of all, why is a terrorist organization such as the Taliban, are they the alternative and the only alternative we have against corruption? Why couldn't we just implicate the people who are corrupt in the ICC? I'm in the Netherlands right now on my way to The Hague, actually. But why aren't we putting pressure on them for the last 20 years? Why did no one put pressure on where the corruption was, held those people accountable? Why are the Taliban being allowed to rebrand themselves? Why were they even allowed in the first place to rebrand themselves? Will the KKK, will the Nazis be allowed to rebrand themselves? What's the difference? The Taliban are even worse. The Taliban invented child suicide bombers. I've been a vocal voice against Islamic extremism. And I think right now, people have stopped talking about terrorism. No one's talking about the threat of terrorism anymore. And it's terrifying. Our brave ANDSF soldiers were on the front line fighting against terrorism for the last 20 years, not just keeping Afghanistan safe, but the entire world safe. And at this point, for whatever reasons, they were told not to fight. I have videos, I have phone calls from our soldiers on the front line who were crying to fight. And they were told from their superiors not to fight. There were deals that were made in Pakistan. There were deals that were made abroad that, okay, let the Taliban come in. And whenever the Taliban come in, this person will get their portion of the government. That completely fell apart whenever the president left, and it gave all the power to the Taliban. Whatever it is, at this point where we are and why this Protection Act is so important is because these people who were loyal to the United States, who are loyal not just to the United States, but for democracy, for peace, they feel betrayed. And if you think about it, for 20 years, they've given up their family members. There's widows, there's orphans because of this long 20-year war. And they truly, and I believe the United States would have stood with me the entire time. We're still in disbelief and in shock that our country was left to terrorists. At this point, we have two options. There's a discussion that's being had that's saying, okay, well, when there's another attack, we need to retain the loyalty of these ex-soldiers and these people who are pro-democracy. We need to keep them by our side so we can go back and fight. Okay, that's fine. You can think of it in that way. But the other way that you have to think about it is that if we don't help them, and if the United States doesn't stand with these people, they're going to go elsewhere. They're either going to go to another country to ally with, or even worse, they're going to ally with an extremist organization. And we don't want that. We don't want them to think that democracy, the NATO countries, is the wrong way. I personally don't believe that the Taliban will last forever. And I believe that the American people are good people and they're just ill-informed. They don't know what happened. I don't think the American people are completely 100% informed on what happened on the ground in Afghanistan and what's really going on. How an insurgent group was able to keep fighting in a country for over 20 years. In the history of the world, there's never been an insurgency that's able to keep fighting for over 20 years without a neighboring country's assistance. I'm sorry, I'm exhausted too. My speech is a little all over the place. But without a neighboring country helping them, they wouldn't be able to exist. They wouldn't have been able to terrorize Afghanistan and the rest of the world for as long as they could. If Pakistan, just being very open about this, wasn't supplying them with weapons, with money, with a safe haven. The American people that I've met, they don't know about this. Yeah. The American people that I know, they don't know that Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan and not in Afghanistan. The American people that I know, they don't know that North Korea has nuclear weapons because of Pakistan and not Afghanistan or anyone else. And I think this is important because we need to address the fundamental issues, the foundational issues of why this is happening in the first place, not for the safety of Afghanistan, but the safety for the whole world. And it scares me. It terrifies me that right now, an entire country is being led by terrorists. One of the first decrees that they signed was outlawing drugs. What did that do? Everyone was saying, oh, wow, look at the Taliban change. No, not really. They took the price of opium from $300 a kilo to $1,200 a kilo. They're a narco-rich country that is gloating to the entire world that we beat the United States, we beat the NATO forces. This has empowered every Islamic extremist around the world, and it's scary. We can't let this go on. 50% of our nation is now not able to go to school. They're the main people who are in the most danger. I'll tell you right now, someone who's very close to me, who was a special forces soldier, right now is in a Taliban prison in Kabul, in Shashtarak, probably being tortured if he's not killed by now. And I can't do anything about it. The people who left in the beginning, I'm so happy they left, but there's a lot more who need to be protected. And we cannot forget them because it's not just for Afghanistan. It's much bigger than that. It impacts every single person all over the world. If there's no security there, Al-Qaeda is already showing their faces there. Daesh is spreading in Afghanistan. And it's terrifying. So again, thank you for being there for us. Thank you all for allowing us to speak. And I really hope that we stand by the Afghan ex-soldiers, because we stood and fought for democracy for 20 years. I've been in Germany recently and in the US. Both places, we stand with Ukraine, but both places, Ukrainians are fast-tracked through. Mm-hmm. Okay, I get it, that's fine. But we stood and fought and died for democracy. How come we're not treated with a little bit of that? You know what I mean? The vetting process is important. It's really important. But I have a friend who is a spokesperson with our intelligence agency. He's an ex-Talib. He understands the psyche of the Taliban better than anyone does. Right now, he's in Kosovo. And he was in extreme danger. He's someone that the U.S. should utilize. He understands the complete psyche of the Taliban. He was the head of the local forces in Ghazni. He has killed more Taliban and the PSYOPs against Taliban more than anyone I know. He's counterintelligence, and he's also done counterterrorism, counter extremism courses within the people to deter them from becoming Taliban and becoming extremists. But he's someone who's been stuck now for almost a year. Since August, he's been stuck in Kosovo. So these are people that need to be utilized within the U.S. government, within the international community, because this isn't the end. Sad to say, but pulling out as irresponsibly as the United States did, it started a new beginning, and we don't know where we're going. And I hope and I pray that I'm wrong and nothing bad happens, but it doesn't seem like it. So this Protection Act is extremely important for the future of the world. Again, Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And it seems, just by hearing what you're talking about, that an Afghan Adjustment Act is a simple thing, and it seems the least that we could do to begin to rebuild trust with the Afghan people. And I think it's a good springboard to go to Laura and ask about the status of Afghans who are still in Afghanistan and some of the risks, and even the status of further evacuations to get out some of the the people that Miriam is talking about.
Thanks very much, Jason. And again, I just want to echo my thanks and gratitude for the opportunity to be here, but moreover, for all of you who are attending today, whose hearts and energy are really dedicated to our at-risk Afghan allies and friends. I might be unique amongst the panelists, I'm not sure. I'm actually here as a volunteer. I don't get paid for any of the work that I have done to support at-risk Afghans. But for the last 6 years, I've done a lot of voluntary work for a US public charity that supports refugees. And so in August, when at-risk Afghan families reached out to me, I think many of us felt like we couldn't look away, and we had to roll up our sleeves, get involved, and do what we can. And over the last 9 months, that's evolved into co-founding this organization called Force Nix, where we are specifically focused on at-risk marginalized populations, including women, who otherwise might not have a resettlement pathway. So before I begin going into the question you asked, Jason, I think there's kind of two things that I want to frame this conversation with. The first is that any policy decision any government, including the US, takes has a real life implication on a family. And these families are like yours and mine. These are moms, these are dads, these are kids. These are people who worked their entire lives, were educated, and all they wanted was the opportunity to, one, support the ideas of freedom and democracy, and two, to be able to provide for their young families. I think the second thing is that we also need to recognize is that the pathways that have been set up by the United States and other NATO governments are actually quite limited in their eligibility criteria. So while we talk about people who might be eligible for a special immigrant visa, there are other people who were government politicians, or maybe they were journalists or human rights defenders, who sadly kind of fall outside of these existing pathways and yet still have taken on substantial risks to themselves and to their families. As we look at Afghanistan today, like 9 months on from the evacuation, I think the Taliban quickly made it very clear that they were not a different organization. There was not a Taliban 2.0, and that they would continue their relentless and violent campaign assaulting human rights, and specifically targeting those who did work alongside US forces or US democratic or development institutions promoting civil liberties, women's rights, and human rights in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And I think that's kind of led to kind of three major groups. I think there's folks who are at a national risk in Afghanistan, and that just means there's probably no place of safety or refuge for them in the country. It would be people like Miriam, who held a national position either in the government or in a government institution. But there's also people who are at a real local risk. Maybe they were active in civil society in their local communities, or maybe they were a case like I helped last week of a lady whose husband was sadly murdered by the Taliban in August. She was made a widow and forced by local Taliban into a violent forced marriage. And were it not for the support of specialized NGOs, she would likely not be alive today, and her 4 young boys would face an uncertain future in Afghanistan. So even in her position, while she herself did not directly work for an NGO or for the United States, the departure of the US government and Western troops has really led to a deterioration in the security situation for a vast multitude of people. And I think you compound this with the raising and escalating humanitarian crisis, people not being able to have jobs, particularly those who worked for the US government, the US military, or US funded institutions. It's leading to pretty desperate circumstances and situations. So that's kind of the overall context. It's very difficult, Jason. It's very grim. And every day I get countless voice messages and phone calls from people who are literally just seeking, some amount of support, some funding to either keep them safe or feed their families. The second part of the question you ask is kind of what's the pace of evacuations? It really depends country to country. I'll speak specifically because we're focused on the US about what the United States is doing. So the Department of State has set some eligibility criteria for who would be eligible for relocation support to the United States. Typically, those people are flown to a processing in a third country, and they are there a month for additional vetting before coming to the United States. A lot of these are special immigrant visa holders, but they are those who are at a much more developed part of that immigration pathway. So you actually do have a number of folks who are eligible to come to the United States, but probably are still facing, a long wait in country for the opportunity that they have been promised by the government. Other countries, again, they have not seemed to be able to process additional Afghan asylum seekers or on humanitarian visas or protection status. Most of the eligible pathways are quite limited in their bandwidth. So as Miriam mentioned, she had a number of friends who are in Afghanistan, and the words that she herself used were, "There's nothing I can do to help them." And so I do think there is, a level of frustration for NGOs who are operating in this space, because even if we scale up resources, we relocate people into a safer third country location for processing, those processing timelines are about 18 to 24 months, and that is as and when appointments become available. I think there's definitely more that can be done. I call out to each and every one of you who are listening today, there is always something that you can do, and the work that you do actually can make a significant impact. So very firstly, get involved in your local community, really support resettlement of Afghans who have arrived. They are part of this pipeline, and if we can't resettle them with the dignity that they deserve, then we aren't actually going to be able to efficiently move more folks out of danger in Afghanistan and into the United States ultimately. I think the second thing is, get on the phone, speak to your community leaders, your faith-based leaders, veterans leaders, your representatives, tell them why you care so much about giving Afghans the dignity of a pathway to permanent status through an Afghan Adjustment Act. And then, there's countless ways that you can get involved with organizations like Force Nix. We're a member of a group called the Afghan Evac Coalition. Put us into Google, check us out. There's a number of about 180 different NGOs who are operating in this space. All of us are always looking for donors or volunteers. So there is a limitless number of things that you can practically and actively do to make a real difference in this very important issue.
Thank you so much. And in the next panel, we'll hear a little bit more about some of the organizations that are on the ground and hopefully can reiterate some of those ways that we can get involved. So Chris, if we could speak a little bit to the veteran experience and why this issue matters really to veterans and why it's important for veterans of the Afghan war, and not only Afghan war. In the next session, we'll have someone who's in Iraq. Why it is so important that we support the Afghan people.
Yeah, thanks. And just context, I have a contractor at my house, so you might hear some drilling. If it's too loud, just let me know and we'll move on. But this is really important for veterans. And I just want to call out Miriam's very eloquent remarks earlier when she said, we need to stand with the soldiers of Afghanistan, the fighters of Afghanistan. The veteran community here in the United States agrees with that, but we also say we need to stand with the people of Afghanistan. We spent 20 years, like Miriam and many people have said here, trying to build a democracy. And there's a great podcast out right now from Lawfare called Allies that is on their 6th or 7th episode. I can't remember, but they make this case that veterans and military folks and government folks across the spectrum really put their all in for 20 years to build that country up. I think many veterans like myself go throughout the day and people find out that I'm a veteran and they say, "Oh, thank you for your service." Can't tell you how much I hate that, but okay, fine. We'll roll with it. But what really, at the end of the day, we don't want your thank you for your service, handshake or the 10% off at Applebee's. I like going to Lowe's and getting a discount, but really what we want is we want people to listen to us. We want people to see what is important to us, and what promises have we made to the world, to our allies. And we want Americans to cash the check that we wrote with our blood, with our treasure, with the trauma that we've gone through trying to bring freedom and prosperity and democracy across the world. We wrote a check to Afghanistan, and right now that check is worthless because American politicians failed to cash it. American media personalities, frankly, have decided to make this a broader political issue. You can look at Newsmax, for example. I'll never forget in the height of the evacuation, and Newsmax is a highly partisan media outlet. I'm well aware of that. But one of the evacuation groups went on there and basically told the truth. And the truth is that President Trump signed a peace deal with the Taliban that facilitated the collapse of the Afghan government. That is the truth. And we can argue about Biden's role in that, and that's fine too. But that veteran, that combat veteran that was at that moment evacuating people from Afghanistan was set upon with death threats, had to be relocated from his home, only because he was just trying to tell the Americans that, hey, we have an obligation to these people, and it doesn't matter who started it, but we have to finish it. So it's just, this is more than a partisan political issue for us. This is about our national honor that has been lost, and it's everyone's responsibility. No one is blameless here, and I just hope that the American public can just own that and step up and say, we need to fix this. We just one little thing to fix it. Afghan Adjustment Act is one way to do it. There's other ways you could do it, like joining Laura's organization, donating your time, talent, and treasure to refugee agencies. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. We have a great, thriving refugee community in Clarkston, which is about 20 minutes away, where people go to contribute to the refugee community. So we're just asking people, just don't thank us, just work with us. So,
yeah. Thank you so much for that kind of perspective. And it's really interesting to have this conversation with with veterans and to hear similar perspectives as to what you've talked about. So we have a little bit of time to kind of go around, and maybe there's been something that hasn't been said yet. And I know we haven't got to the vetting piece yet. And so maybe as we go around, if one of you would be willing to speak to that question about why that's really not a good reason to oppose the Afghan adjustment. But very briefly, take a minute to just think about what hasn't been said that you'd really like to be said. And I'm going to go around as I see you on my screen. So I'm going to start with Danilo and Miriam, if you're able as well. I'll end with you. But Danilo, what hasn't been said that you wish or think needs to be said?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of that's been said is a lot of the issues here have been covered really well, I think, and it's part of the reason I'm so appreciative to be a part of this panel. I'm happy to touch a little bit on the vetting process. One of the things we've done at the forum is talk with some counterterrorism and national security experts about the vetting process, and this was early on in the evacuation to make sure they were comfortable with what happened, and they were, and so we put out some resources on that. And I really want to emphasize how robust the vetting process was for the Afghans who entered, especially given the dynamics of an emergency evacuation. So, we discussed how a lot of these folks first went to lily pad locations before coming to the US. And there was really a quite significant vetting procedure that was led by DHS in coordination with the DoD, FBI, the US Army, intelligence community, biometric and biographic enrollment, screening and vetting. I think each and every evacuee was given a unique number and enrolled into a biometric database, and we can get into all those different databases, but it was sent to the National Targeting Center, checked against all of DHS's biometric holdings, and all this biometric vetting is especially, I think, viable in this context because of all the markers and phone numbers, et cetera, that we've picked up in 20 years in Afghanistan. I mean, it's extremely significant, and we're talking about prints that were lifted up off of IEDs in Afghanistan that are being checked against, that sort of thing. So it was a remarkably robust process. Any flags were taken for additional screening and vetting. And the last thing I would say about that is that, if for whatever reason there are still any concerns, the absolute best way to address them is via an adjustment act, right? So that would require an in-person interview, provide additional assurance that, all of this biometric and biographic data has been collected and checked against all the available databases. And again, all this information that I just shared is from DoD reports on the issue. So it was a remarkably robust process. I certainly don't have any concerns, and I know the national security experts that we've talked to, even those who are working in refugee vetting processes under the Trump administration, don't have concerns. But even if you did, the Adjustment Act is the way to address them. So that's kind of my response. I really don't think that this is an issue that should stop the passage of a bill that would be so important and that could even contribute to addressing those concerns.
Yeah. Laura, what would you want to add to that? Or are there any other things that you wish had been said that haven't been said yet?
I just want to emphasize, Jason, that all of the Afghans that I've been in contact with, and I know organizations and NGOs would echo this as well, are some of the most brilliant, capable, enterprising, caring, amazing human beings that I've had the opportunity to interact with, and they would be a huge asset to any community that is lucky enough to welcome them. And so I think it's often easy to see numbers on a headline or think about big picture macro stories, but really I just want everyone to remember like the people behind these stories. And I'll give one specific example and then we can kind of move on to another panelist. This week I was put in touch with an SIV applicant, and he is in a midway through the process awaiting an interview. So hopefully that means in the next 6 to 9 months, he'll be able to be on his path to the United States. This man sent me 74 photos of him with various members of the United States military, including a video montage that he put together. He told me at length how proud he was of his service to both his country in Afghanistan, but also on behalf of the American government, protecting and defending the ideals of freedom and democracy and what that meant for America's national security interests. You could not meet somebody who is more proud to have the opportunity to serve the United States and our military interests than this man. And he would be a wonderful neighbor, an amazing friend. And just, I really hope and pray that all of us here think about what role we have to play into creating these dignified and welcoming pathways for Afghans who worked so tirelessly along with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Lindsay, is there anything that you would like to add?
I think everybody has touched so well on everything. So I will let someone else go, but if anything pops in, I might.
All right.
And yeah, if people have questions, I'm also happy to answer them.
Yeah. I don't see any questions in the chat, but Chris, is there anything you'd like to add? I know you just kind of ended a little bit ago, but any other things that haven't been said that you wish had been?
Just give me a chance to speak and I'll keep going. So
go for it.
No, well, two things. One, Ukraine was brought up earlier, and I think the U.S. government does not like us comparing Afghanistan to Ukraine, and I'm sorry, State Department, if you're listening. But the fact is that what the United for Ukraine program that the USG stood up basically overnight to let in 100,000 Ukrainians in under humanitarian parole shows what the White House can do when it puts its mind together. And if they are telling us that they cannot, put their weight to get an Afghan Adjustment Act across the finish line, I don't know. I'm sure there's a beach in Arizona that I can sell as well. The other thing that I want to say is this is not going away. We are not leaving. It's been almost 10 months since the fall of Kabul and the destruction of the country there. But we have a whole ecosystem that we are prepared we have set up for the long haul. Susanna and myself are on the steering committee of the Evacuate Our Allies Coalition. Laura is in Afghan Evac, two entrenched organizations that are pushing this forward, in addition to all the hundreds of other independent advocate or organizations that are maybe not affiliated, but are keeping this movement going. So that's the civil society piece. Then the government is also setting up for this for the long haul. So we know that the State Department is planning for a years-long mission to keep the relocation efforts going. So we just need to keep this in the public eye, remind Americans that there is going to be many opportunities for us to keep engaging. But if it's all going to be for naught if they're, like Lindsay said, sitting in asylum backlog for 5 years. So, and with that, I'll stop.
All right. And Susanna, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, wow. So many things. We've been told by our Republican and Democratic leads in both chambers that the reason why this bill has been kept alive is because of the groundswell of support that has existed even from very early on, that there, quote, has never been a bill that is not yet introduced that has been talked about so much. The reason that Congress still has to address this is because of the persistence and organization of advocates. We've literally created the reality that the U.S. government has tried to avoid. And Chris touched on this notion that some people have that this will go away. My career started with helping with interpreters who were facing persecution in Iraq during the insurgency, 2007 to 2009, and I have worked with military service members around their interpreters' cases during that period, and they have not given up. They haven't given up after years and years of bureaucracy and stonewalling, and it was one of the things that we faced in April to August 2021, which was, we saw both Congress and the administration really misread the level of dedication there was. And for many of us, for veterans, this was no surprise. For people who would work with veterans on their interpreters' cases, there was no surprise, because if someone was willing to walk shoulder to shoulder on American bureaucracy in regard to their special immigrant visa applications, they were not going to disappear in the final months of the US military engagement. Yeah. It was, we tried to express as much as we could, through the sort of channel of communication that was happening through the press, that there was a miscalculation. And I think we certainly see that. It's why we continue to see editorial boards write about the need for an Afghan Adjustment Act months and over a year later. Just this gall that for 20 years you could ask the American public to care about Afghanistan. And they're surprised that it worked. Their hope that it would disappear from the American psyche. For much of us, if you just look at our age alone, our upbringing, our adult upbringing, was through a post 9/11 world in which the story of Afghan women, of the opportunity to vote, of the idea of a promise somehow of democracy would be the ultimate goal for Afghans, even when the military goal seemed totally obscure. And I think for, as one veteran wrote in the Des Moines Register, in Iowa, that promise that he had in serving in Afghanistan was there might be that promise of democratic opportunity and of a future. And that even though what they had hoped for in Afghanistan, including what Afghans had hoped for, as Miriam put so well, folded beneath so many of us, that for those people who got here to the US, that there might be that promise for them, that in these small acts that we might be able to give them the future of prosperity, that their daughters might be able to go to school and serve and work in their communities and be leaders. And I think that the interest in getting allies from Afghanistan remains for all of us. But the idea that the interest of protecting and serving them ends the moment they land within the US borders seems disingenuous. And I don't think it aligns with the American public. And I hope that we're able to see it through. And I'll just echo what these legislators and the lead sponsors of the bill have said, that the only reason this is alive is because of the American people refusing to let Congress forget.
Yeah, no, good. Thank you. Thank you so much. And Miriam, we just got a couple of minutes left, but if you're still there, if you'd be willing to just kind of end our session, if there's anything else you'd like to add.
Well, thank you, Jason. And first and foremost, Chris, thank you for your service in Afghanistan. You don't know, I'm going to get emotional right now, but you changed the life of so many men and women in Afghanistan. And I pray that we don't forget the people who are left behind, that it's not just about the refugees and the people who are here now, because these aren't ordinary refugees who are running for a better life, for a better financial, economic life, or like planning to become refugees. These are political asylum refugees. These are people who are never planning on leaving Afghanistan. Crystal Bayat was supposed to be here. And when people would talk about like, well, where did all our money go in Afghanistan? I really want to show Crystal. I want to show myself. I want to say, okay, this isn't a waste. Crystal, she's 20. I'm 38. I'm a little bit older, but Crystal, she had never seen the United States. She had never seen the Taliban. She grew up in a democratic and free Afghanistan. The girl was a businesswoman, a civil activist. She never planned on leaving. Some of the most talented people I've met in my life are self-taught from Afghanistan, award-winning coders, journalists, writers, speakers. These are not ordinary, regular, financially motivated refugees that are coming to the United States. These are people that can bring something to the US. I think we need patience, we need care, and I think that the American people have that, and I've seen that, especially when I visited Utah. I live in California, but when I came to Utah, I really saw how amazing the people were to the refugees, and you could see that the refugees, they had this like light in their eyes again. And I pray and I hope that all the refugees get to see that, because they can be an amazing part of the society in the US. And thank you all for all of your work. And please don't forget, we have a lot. I think in the next session, we'll talk more about what's going on in Afghanistan, but thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for being willing to be on this panel and share your own experience. And I think for all of us, I know for myself, it's the Afghan people that I've gotten to know, Halima and Riza, if you're listening, the beauty and the courage and the strength that I think that they all have. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. This has been very informative. And hopefully it has been helpful for people who are out there. We're now going to take a moment to switch people over. And so those of you who are on the panel now will go to attendee and we'll put the other panelists on. And as that is being done, I'll just talk a little bit about the National Immigration Forum and what our work is as a nonpartisan organization that really is seeking a kind of bipartisan solution to not just the Afghan Adjustment Act, but also to issues like DACA and just immigration reform. And one of the things too that I'll add, and getting to work with the Mormon Women for Ethical Government has just been a delight, and Miranda can speak to the work that they're doing as they begin the next session. But just a reminder that one of the things that we are going to ask people to do, and Miranda will talk about this at the very end, but I'm going to send out a newsletter where we ask that you contact your senators, Senator Grassley, Senator Ernst, Senator Sass. These are the ones who are in my area, but Republican senators on the Judiciary Committee who really hold a lot of power on this issue. We just need to overwhelm them with our support for the Afghan people and for the support of this Afghan Adjustment Act. And now I'm going to turn it over to Miranda.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Wow, that was an amazing first session that we had. I really appreciate everyone who was able to join us. And now we have, it's like we're getting people, our panelists. So Miriam is still here with us, and we also have, and Miriam has already introduced herself, but we also have Jeffrey Wells. Do we have Jeffrey here? Let's see, Jeffrey. There you are, Jeffrey. Okay, so Jeffrey is an Afghan evac leader and a cybersecurity professional. He was great to step in just last minute as his colleague Danielle Cosgrove got sick. So we really appreciate you joining us. We also have Yenny Tellis. I should have asked about pronunciations of names. Did I say your name right, Yenny? Okay, great. And you're on mute, just so you know. Yenny has worked with children and families for more than 15 years, and she is with the International Rescue Committee, IRC, in Kansas. She has a lot of experience with trauma, people who've experienced trauma, and so I hope that we can talk about that here. And we also have Mercedes Dimas. Did I say your name right, Mercedes? I hope.
Dimas.
Okay. And Mercedes works with the Mary J. Treglia Community House as a refugee coordinator and has really been on the ground helping Afghan resettlement efforts. And we also have Kyle Rains, who is a pastor at the New Life Church in Dubuque, Iowa, where they have been resettling Afghan families and sponsoring them as they come to their communities. And let's see. And we also have Lark Escobar here. I'm so glad you were able to join us, Lark. Lark is also a combat veteran who served in Afghanistan and has been assisting with resettlement efforts. I think I got everyone. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Let's start with Mariam. Could you just briefly tell us what is the current situation in Afghanistan for those who are left behind? What does daily life look like for the people, particularly the women and children who are still living there?
Hi, Miranda. Thank you again for having me. And I'm excited to be on this side of the panel. The one thing that I forgot to say in my introduction before was that I'm a director at an NGO called Afghan Peace Watch, APW. And what we do, we're one of the only grassroots NGOs that are still in Afghanistan. This actually started when the negotiations between the Taliban and the US government started. And they were talking about reduction in violence. So we were monitoring the reduction in violence in Afghanistan. And now this has crossed over to monitoring in a very grassroots level. Not grassroots, it's a very like covert operation, basically. That's what I'm going to say. Over 400 districts, we have people in every district that's secretly giving us information on what's going on the ground. We have metadata, we have videos, we have pictures of what's happening while the Taliban are talking about how there's peace in Afghanistan, how that there's no more fighting, that there's no more killing. They've said that they've given amnesty to anyone who was threatened before, all the soldiers, and to be precise, there's been over 4,000 incidents that have been recorded since January of this year. And if we talk about August, it's even more. The biggest issue that we're seeing is that every Talib, it's a very decentralized system in Afghanistan. So every Talib is judge, jury, and executioner. It's been over 250 days, I think it's 262 days as of today, that women above the sixth grade are no longer allowed to go to school. Women are not allowed to show their faces. Women are not allowed to leave 15 kilometers away from their house without a male companion with them. If a woman does not abide by veiling their face, the male that's responsible for them will be beaten. So the only jobs, if there's an educated woman and if education is allowed, the only career choices a woman might be able to have in Afghanistan would be a midwife, a teacher, or maybe a female security officer that can do pat downs and things on women. Other than that, there's no hopes, there's no dreams left in Afghanistan for women. We have women who are missing right now that the Taliban have taken under custody. Crystal had more information on that. I wish she was here to tell you the exact numbers of how many women are gone. We had hundreds of safe houses in Afghanistan where women who were in danger of either an honor killing or beating, or they were afraid of their husband, forced marriages, child marriages, we would have a system where there would be safe houses for them. Those have all been closed down since the arrival of the Taliban. And now we're seeing women who are purposely committing crimes to be put in jail, because being put in jail is better than what they would have to deal with at home. And the reason that we're seeing this, especially towards women, there's a story by an ex-American soldier, Matt Zeller. He said that he had an interpreter and also an ANDSF soldier who would fight next to him, who saved his life on many occasions. And he said, how can you fight with me? How can you stand by my side? And there's another man from your same village across from us trying to fight us. And he told him, he said, well, you know, I got my mother's prayers to fight with you. And he said, well, what about that Talib who's fighting against us? He said, well, he has his mother's prayers too. He said, well, what's the difference? He said, the difference is that my mother was educated. My mother could read the holy books and understand what was really good, what was really what life was meaning, what goodness was, what evil was. And his mother is illiterate, and so keeping women illiterate is basically keeping generations illiterate. They say one educated mother, one educated woman is generations of education throughout families. And so one of the main sources of recruitment for extremists and terrorism is finding these really impoverished and illiterate communities where there is a lack of education. And you'll see that through the last 20 years, we've monitored this. We have information on how many exactly. Every time a girls' school would be built, they would go and destroy it. They'd burn it down. And they made a very, very calculated effort in keeping education out of reach for certain communities to keep this recruitment mechanism going on. So currently, I just told you about the women and the children, but even the men right now are in hell. Anyone who believes in a free Afghanistan, democracy, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, it's been cut down completely. There are videos of the Taliban destroying musical instruments. They've gone to Kabul University and destroyed statues of that girls and boys have made in their art classes, sculptures and things of such. And in people's private homes, any type of artistry or any type of expression, freedom of expression, that's completely been eradicated from society at the moment. So what you hear in media is one thing, and what's going on the ground is something completely different. I've gone to the UN about 4 different times now, and I've begged for a monitoring mechanism to be placed in Afghanistan, because how can we expect the Afghan people to speak when they feel completely abandoned, when they feel like, okay, if I speak, who will stand by me and protect me? The United Nations isn't there. There's no NATO forces there. There's no one there watching what happens. So if you're going to ask an average Afghan in Afghanistan, or even a refugee who still has family in Afghanistan that could be put in harm's way, they're not going to tell you the truth. And so one of the most important things that we need is a monitoring mechanism in Afghanistan by the UN, a safe corridor where they can monitor the amnesty cards, where Afghan women and men can tell the truth and find some type of safety and security. Until then, I don't think that we're going to hear the truth of what's going on. And I think when I say the number over 4,000, I think that's a very modest number. And in reality, we're seeing a lot more atrocities happening on a daily basis. I can send you videos that will turn your stomach over how abused these people are. And constantly, the Geneva Convention is being pressed to their limits and being surpassed. You're finding people with their hands tied up and their necks cut. The violence against Shias and minority groups in Afghanistan has escalated on a different level. Just because you're from a certain province, you're being killed. Just because you're from a certain tribe, you're being killed. And the thing is that it's coming from a group that does not represent the Afghan nation. The Taliban, you have to remember this, is representative of an extremist ideology that is not natural to Afghanistan. Historically, we're a spiritual people, but we have never been what the Taliban are. The burqa is not our culture. Even in the group that I represent are the Kuchis, the nomads. We're Pashtun and we're the majority. In our history, we've never covered our faces. We've been nomadic people. We've herd goats and sheep and cows and camels. And even in the last regime of the Taliban in the 90s, they weren't able to enforce that law on the Kuchi women. And this is just another law to help recruit Islamic extremists by keeping our people suppressed and illiterate. Again, thank you. And I'm really looking forward to listening to the next panelists.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And she really brings up an important point in that we talked about before, and that is that the Afghan Adjustment Act is really just a first step. There's so much more that we need to do in Afghanistan to keep our promises that we have made. Jeff, could you talk to us a little bit about, are we still doing evacuations, and what pathways are there for those seeking refuge that are still there?
Sure, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to attempt to fill Danielle's shoes, and they are quite large. And so I'm quite honored to be here, especially by the demonstration of everyone's immense kindness and empathy in supporting our Afghan friends and fellow humans, which I think is an incredibly important part of this entire discussion. We are talking about humans. And I just want to remind that, yeah, at the moment, yes, we still are doing resettlements. The Taliban do not care for us to use the word evacuations, but there are flights that are sponsored and approved by the United States government. And we have, as someone mentioned earlier, I'm with Afghan Evac, which helps coordinate over 180 different organizations that are supporting Afghans either on the ground to movement, to provide food and shelter, to resettlement across the entire spectrum. And so, yes, we are moving various Afghans and their family members on semi-regular flights as best that the Kabul airport can be supported. And but those are small aircraft, and the regional, and we're limited at numbers. So we have one location in Qatar where the Afghans have the opportunity to go to be processed through legitimate pathways. But the real challenges that we often see, is the decisions that in the agency that Afghans are forced to try to consider. And as Miriam pointed out, the situation on the ground is untenable, and the volume of folks that are moving is not sufficient, and there's just a flight of 180 is not going to make a significant difference in any given week. But the other options that Afghans are presented with are often maybe some situations that are sort of brilliant and kind-hearted by providing overland movement to Pakistan or to Iran and other places without and so those are very kind-hearted and important processes, but unfortunately that's where the kindness sort of ends, is that the entire process of helping Afghans move from Afghanistan to someplace else, then onward to have legitimate pathways to the United States or to other countries, takes an inordinate amount of time, an inordinate amount of resources, and those are financial resources as well as human resources. And we're talking about, in a world where there's 80 million displaced people already. And so, moving folks, as I think Miriam mentioned, to Kosovo or to Bosnia, and they're kind of stuck there, is that there's these log jams that were some created by governments and reinforced by governments, others by organizations early on, as I got involved in this in August, and it was just anything we can do to get Afghans someplace, with the belief that the long-term goal would be to resettle, and there'd be a process of keeping our promise to our fellow Afghans that served by my side, served by my friend's side, that American blood, was shed for 20 years, and the promise that was made. I kind of want to reiterate what the last panel had said. Wasn't a promise if you kind of stuck by us, we'd take care of you forever. The promise was, if you adopt the ideals of liberalism and democracy, we will stand by your side. That was the promise, and that women and girls and men, but just and others, you can be what you want to be, and you can pursue your dream of playing music, developing art, embracing culture, learning. Those are the promises that we made, and those promises are dried up. And to Chris Purdy's point, why as a veteran was this important. I have Afghans that stood by my side, that I spent time with, that are still stuck in Afghanistan under threat. I have girls' school, many members who I had worked with, who are still there. I can't get them out. And there's lots of bureaucratic reasons for that, for paperwork that takes a long time. But it's, the throughput and the volume. We just don't have enough resources to get them beyond the legitimate what we call lily pad and Qatar. But the AAA, the Afghan Adjustment Act, would help open this up to provide resources and services to opening up the United States to communities with financial resources, with human resources, and with the ability for them for Afghans to come in and really add value and be part of those communities. We all know it enriches us all, and anyone who's ever spent time with Afghans can't help but fall in love with them, as I have. Is that we at Afghan EVAC continue on a daily basis, all volunteers, to try to facilitate the various organizations that are trying to keep this moving. Chris dropped off to join a Department of State call to talk about how do we continue to improve the processes. We work with the Department of Defense. How do we continue to figure out ways to provide pathways for those who served in the Special Forces or the ANA in various categories? And so that trying to assign categories to humans is incredibly painful for me to watch and hear, but that's the reality of what we're living with. And the AAA would open that door up to welcome humans, just as we're doing with others around the world at the moment. And as volunteers, we don't work for anybody, so we can continue, as Chris said, we're not going to go away until there is a solution. And we've got historic backgrounds of how the United States has done this in the past. We're slow to look at those. And the vetting question, I think, is an irrelevant question. We have vetted the Afghans better than we have vetted most folks who are our next door neighbors. We know more about them than we know about most of anybody who's serving in the United States military at the moment or in USCIS. So when the vetting question comes up, I say, here you go. We've got more information than anybody sitting in Congress. Long answer, as my daughter would say. Thanks for attending your TED Talk, Dad. But we are still moving people and Afghans, women and children, trying to really find ways to reunify families, to keep what is another important piece. I think is the United States definition of family, very different from the Afghan definition of family, and understanding that we need to kind of adopt that thinking when we're talking about reunification and clear pathways, because family units are incredibly important to our survival as a whole.
Thank you so much, Jeff. You bring up so many important points, and that family reunification is so important. And as you mentioned, as you meet the human beings, I know in my community here in Salt Lake City, I see Carrie Wickman's here on the call, and she has helped resettle a family from Afghanistan, in which there are, I believe it's 2 children who they were part of those initial evacuations, and they left without their parents. And just to hear them speak about that experience is just heartbreaking. And that's one family of so many other families. I saw a headline, I think today, about a 2-year-old who was just reunified with his family here in the United States. And I'm so grateful for the volunteers and others who are working to not forget to keep making this happen. Mercedes, could you address what is the experience of Afghan evacuees and I'm blanking on the other term, parolees is what we call them, as they are resettling in the United States? What has been your experience in your community as you've helped resettle families?
Yeah, so I would say overall the experience has been challenging, to say the least. Not even for our agency, it's for the people. You have those obvious struggles of being in a completely new country with a new language, having to find a job that's completely different from what you were used to and isn't necessarily part of a skill set that you brought with you, and kind of trying to adjust to this new place. And what we've seen a lot is that then there are those subtle struggles that we knew there would be some trauma, there would be some PTSD, some mental health issues, but it wasn't recognized until they were here, because for many of them that I've spoken to, that's kind of the life they lived was not necessarily a peaceful one. They kind of were just used to these things that were happening. And then now being separated from their family and separated from what their daily life was has just been extremely triggering and very traumatic for a lot of, I could say for everyone, and so that has definitely been something that's been really challenging for them. And we've done our best to support that and recognize those, and really just starting the initial conversations of this is, your mental health and these things that you're feeling, it's okay to feel them. And then this is how we can continue to help you and support you. And I would say that for those who have had that constant case management support or that community support, they're doing well. They're doing as best as they possibly can, considering all of the new challenges that they faced. But there have been a number of them, at least in our community, who left their resettlement agencies thinking that there was a different opportunity for jobs or other opportunities here in our area, who kind of no longer had that support. And it's definitely been way more challenging for them. And so what we've been trying to do just here as an agency is continuing our work with other organizations and partnering with other just other groups and agencies in order to provide that case manager or provide really just that emotional support that they really need. It's been amazing to see the support within the Afghan community. Our initial group that came was 11. It was a family of 11. They all came at once. And of course, they had the same challenges as everyone, being in a new country and new state. And we brought them here to Iowa, and they were like, it is in the dead of winter, so nobody's out walking, nobody is visible to anyone. And they're like, does anyone live here? And we're like, yeah, people live here. You will see them slowly creep out as the weather gets warmer. And we made this joke with them that I'm sure everyone's heard, that there's more cows than people here. And they're like, yeah, we believe that. Like, we do not see another human being. And of course, they're walking around everywhere because transportation is not as accessible, as they're used to. And they anticipated the United States to just be this like city life where everywhere is just big, tall buildings and people are bustling through. And that's not Iowa at all. So, but for that initial group, I think because we work so closely with them and we ensured that, as much as we could provide from housing to jobs to mental health and medical and everything in between, 6 months into their journey here, they are what I would consider them thriving. They are in a place where they are now helping other Afghans and more community members that are coming here. And it's incredible to see. And I feel so grateful to have been a part of that journey and continuing to be a part of that journey. I know that for our community and our agency, we had not experienced this before. Typically when we speak on refugee resettlement, they're coming to reunite with family. And this was a completely different ballgame. And so it forced us to really create those partnerships with other organizations. And I think it woke a lot of us up. And I think that's why these meetings and these type of panels are so important, because we need to be woken up. We need to realize that this is not the first time that we've done this, that we're welcoming a brand new group of people. And unfortunately, we can do better, and I think that our agency, I can speak for us, that we have learned that through them and with them have done better and have provided what they needed. And now with the other groups that are coming, is just our core group is then they're advocating for them, and they're saying, hey, this is where you do this is where you do that, and you can call Mercedes at Married Trailer, or you can go to this agency for that. And it's beautiful to see that if you provide that support, even for the initial group, it's just going to be this domino effect where they're going to continue to help because they have received that support.
Thank you. You bring up so many good points. I wanted to, while I'm remembering, you talked a little bit about the trauma that people have experienced. And I heard an interview recently with Elizabeth Newman, who is a national security expert. And she brought up an interesting point. She said, you would think with these people who are coming to our country as refugees who've experienced so much trauma, that would lead them to do things like, do a mass shooting or something. And that just doesn't happen. We don't see refugees acting out in ways that you might expect, having experienced the trauma that they have. And I think that speaks to their gratitude for having the opportunity to live in America, and also that we are doing a good job overall in welcoming them and helping them feel like a part of our community, a contributing member of our community. And it's not hard, is it? Because
at all. And it's just, it fills you, it just fills your heart. And being able to be, I took part in Eid, right? They had me over for dinner and I couldn't stop crying the entire time I was there, because I was like, man, you were one decision, one choice away from not being here and maybe not even being alive. And that's such a big deal that even though I've been working so closely with these families, I still can't come to terms with. I cannot grasp that because I've never experienced that kind of threat in my life. And it's this overwhelming gratitude of knowing they're here and knowing they're safe and wanting to take care of them and wanting to provide whatever resource they need. And in terms of the mental health part, is like, many of them don't even recognize that there are these mental health issues because they don't know what they don't know, and so kind of starting those conversations, and they're like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, I am losing sleep. I do feel stressed. I am anxious. Okay, well, now you have the support and we have the resources to be able to help you feel better, and then you can feel better. So then when your family is finally able to come, and hopefully that will be sooner than later, then you can help them and you can help other guys that are coming through.
Yeah, great, thank you. Kyle, could you talk to us a little bit about the families that your church has been helping? What have been their experiences, and what have been their biggest wins, biggest difficulties, biggest challenges? Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. So our church kind of fell into helping with the Afghan resettlement. So we're still learning, and I've really been enjoying all the panelists and just learning from everybody today. So we are actually just working with one Pashtun family, and so they have, I would say the biggest wins for us has just been being able to establish relationship and seeing the way that our community has come around the family. So kind of what Mercedes had talked about, just we're in a smaller community in Iowa where there's not a refugee resettlement organization to fall on. So our church, there was a core team of people that kind of pioneered that here, and connecting with local organizations to see that come to fruition. So that's been a really amazing process, and just connecting with different local organizations for different support for the family, and just seeing the way that the family is being able to connect with people despite having some really limited English skills. So I would say, some of our biggest hurdles really are related to language. And then because of language, there's a lot of cultural hurdles that are really hard to overcome. The family that we're working with is coming, is coming out of a very conservative spot where I guess the uncle, dad's brother was sort of the one that was in charge of the family. And so the women in our family have never had any exposure to any education at all. And so, everything kind of filters through dad, which is hard because he's the only one that can work and make decisions and all these kinds of things. So, but we've just really taken on, I think that our team has really tried to just, it's the long game of just staying connected to the family and just continuing to be there for them and building relationship with them. And so I would say, one of our biggest wins has just been seeing all the girls in the family be able to go to school, and them being excited about that and being able to learn kind of for the first time. So that's been a really incredible thing, and being able to sit down and have tea and nuts with the family consistently, just learning more and more about Afghanistan, and I've learned so much from the family just about what it means to really be hospitable. I think we have in our state, we're kind of Iowa nice, and everyone's nice, but not everyone's so welcoming and hospitable the same way. So it's been really interesting, and just learning about that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know in my community here in Utah, many of us are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we have found so many we are a Christian church, but we found so many similarities. We're quite conservative, so many things in common with our Muslim brothers and sisters who are here in our community. And boy, that sitting on the living room floor on pillows with an Afghan family and drinking tea and eating delicious food is priceless, isn't it? I just love that. If you haven't had that experience, I highly recommend finding an Afghan friend so you can do that.
Absolutely.
Yenny, so could you talk to us about how an Afghan Adjustment Act would help resettlement agencies as they work to help Afghan refugees adjust to life in the United States?
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. I have enjoyed listening from all the panelists. And this is definitely a good opportunity for the general public, those who may be interested in learning a little bit more or may have no idea what's going on with the Afghan community, just to learn and maybe it will create a little bit of curiosity of how they can help as well. So before I comment on how it will definitely impact us as refugee agencies, I think what I want to comment first is the importance of passing that and how that is connected to the work that we do, because it definitely makes a huge difference on the resources and everything else that the families will have access to. But first of all, it's a moral obligation, as the panelists and previously mentioned. Our servicemen were there assisting the families, and they work so hard to help with the evacuation and for families to come to the United States. But and then now being in this parolee status, or now maybe going into the asylum status, it doesn't give them a permanency, right? So that's what we're looking for, the opportunity for them to gain that pathway for citizenship, because this just kind of keeps them in the limbo until something is passed. And as we know, the asylum process is very slow. We have huge numbers of applications that are waiting. So all of this happening while the refugees agencies were already struggling because of the reduction in numbers from previous administrations. So we were not even prepared capacity-wise to resettle so many because of, the numbers were reduced every year. So now with the numbers going from 15,000 to 125,000 refugees overall, definitely impacted the work that we do daily because of our capacity. But I think and it comes to the number and the process overall, like I mentioned, having that pathway and passing of AAA definitely will make a difference for the families, because they will continue to stay. But not only that, but family reunification and being able to maintain their job and their status here in the United States. So for us, definitely with IRC, we have 26 organizations across the or offices across the United States. So we have seen a huge number of Afghan families coming in. And as we know, the families are a large number. Usually we're seeing families of 10, 12, and housing probably was one of the things that we were challenged, because overall the housing overall in the United States has been a little challenging. So to be able to have that the families be in a home of 12 people definitely was one of the bigger things that we needed to handle. But by passing this, it will allow us just to be able to continue to have access to the services that they deserve. Medical, like Mercedes was mentioning, mental health access, all of those services, and just not knowing, because of their status as a parolee is temporary, it definitely creates challenges for them to be able to feel like this is their home. They're worried about what may happen in the future if this bill is not passed, because it just brings stability to them and to our communities, because as we're welcoming them, we we're meeting our new neighbors, and then all of a sudden we're seeing how if some of them, if they don't get approved or they don't get to for the asylum process, as we know is so long, it will definitely challenge our communities, their employers, and everyone who is involved in, with the families.
Thank you. Yeah, I used to work for Refugee Services of Texas in Austin, and we experienced that firsthand there when the funding was cut, because I mean that cap of refugees, the funding that goes to the nonprofits, it's all related to that, and suddenly we had to let so many very talented employees go, and then all of a sudden we have these refugees coming back, and you don't have anybody anymore who speaks Dari or Pashto to speak to them, and it's really a problem. And so I'm glad you brought that up, that we need funding from Afghan Adjustment Act and other bills so that we can rebuild the refugee resettlement process and hopefully keep it stable, so that we can recognize that immigrants and refugees help our country, and if we can keep the services stable for them, then everyone wins, right? I love the National Immigration Forum. If you follow them on Twitter, they post every single day a little statement like that, like immigrants they do haikus and everything. I really highly recommend you follow them, because those are great things to share with our friends as we share this gospel of welcoming our refugee friends from Afghanistan and elsewhere. Let's see. Jeffrey, could you talk to us a little bit about, once we pass an Afghan Adjustment Act, what's next? Let's assume it's going to happen tomorrow. And could you also talk a little bit about what we can do to advocate for the Afghan Adjustment Act?
So the what's next, I kind of briefly touched on earlier, is it opens up the pipeline out of Afghanistan, out of Qatar, and other former lily pads to welcome pathways to the United States. Really what kind of comes next then as well, which it was wonderful to hear from Mercedes and Kyle and Yenny talk about, and even yourself, is our communities need to be to open and welcome the Afghans into, not just into the area, but welcome them as neighbors. And Operation Allies Welcome has issued some grants, but as I think the AAA would, I think as Mercedes highlighted, it infuses the local economy with the support, because housing. I was visiting a group for Ramadan in Fort Worth, and there are 2-3 families per apartment at the moment. So it provides additional resources for the IRC that Yenny mentioned. It can help boost up the support and open the resources, both to not just housing, but to medical. I was sitting with another disabled veteran, and who was an Afghan veteran who was a double amputee. He's going to need additional resources as well, and family care, which is incredibly important. I don't know how to address the shortage of formula at the moment, but providing those types of resources but I think as the panel here, especially Kyle mentioned, is welcoming the Afghan families into the community, and understanding that we have more in common than we do in difference. That the family traditions, the family core values of care and love and support for each other, those enrich our communities, and then it begins to spread in a more positive way than if we're not welcoming. That can create other issues, especially that we're not talking about a population that is uneducated, that hasn't been introduced to that. And so by introducing those educated Afghans and their cultures to our local communities, again, we're enriched. And the pathways are, especially in a labor shortage, can really change things in ways that nobody's probably even begins to understand the difference of how. I think if we study history, we might be able to, but I think it really enriches. The second part of your question, I actually just sorry, TBI moment, forgot, was what can we do for the AAA? This is incredibly important, is that every single American has a voice, and that everyone in Washington, D.C., they work for us. And it's incredibly important for them to hear from individuals and their constituents how important this is to them. And a few weeks ago, I saw some mobilization as we tried to bundle this with the Ukraine relief, is calling, visiting, talking, having the conversations and importance, why it's important to your local community, why it's important to you for this. And again, I'm going to remind it, as I said before, this is a humanitarian, human issue. These are real humans that we made a promise to about democracy and our values that we need to continue to support. And that, I'll be frank, the difference right now, when I look at, sort of as Chris pointed out earlier, what's the difference between the Ukrainian and the Afghan situation? To me, it appears to be skin color. That's the only thing I can think of, and it frustrates me. It breaks my heart. Sorry, but this is, as Americans, we have a voice. We need to use it. And it's not just at the polls, it's by contacting them and those that are already sitting in the offices, and really letting them know that they cannot be the barrier and that there are real human lives, real communities that are already impacted on the other end. That's incredibly important. And I think that more, a single voice, a single phone call, a single visit could be the thing that makes the difference. And all politics really is local, and I can't stress that enough. Every single person that's on here, share with their friends as well how important it is to let their representatives and local governments as well know that this is something that they want and need. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Our time is almost finished. We did have a few more questions, but I just want to say thank you to all of you who participated on both this panel and the other one. And we will be sending you an email with lots of options of how to get involved. Our panelists, please let us know if you'd like to include anything in that email with ways that people can donate or volunteer. And we'll also provide some calls to action links so that you can easily contact your legislators. But really, I've been learning lately, it's super easy to just call the congressional switchboard and say, I want to speak to my senator, I want to speak to my representative. You can find scripts that we'll share with you, and just let them know what you think. And those calls are recorded and are, in most cases, reported to the legislators, and that's really powerful. And if we need to make our voices heard so that they know we care about this issue. And again, thank you so much, everyone. Did you want to add anything, Jason? Did I forget any last?
No,
words?
just a big thank you to everyone and for all the work that you do. Many of the people on this panel are right on the front lines of it all. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to
Thank you.
Miranda and Rachel. And we are finished.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.